But at this point, Trump has raised expectations so high, and the people around him as well, again, in the media sphere, that I'm not really sure the president has much of a choice. I have the feeling this thing is going to end up coming out at some point. It'll probably leak, for example, from the Justice Department, because Trump has talked this up for so much, and all of a sudden you get this U-turn, right? And it increasingly looks like the reasoning for the U-turn is that Trump himself is in there.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today I've had Professor Robert Kelly on the show. He's a professor of political science at Pusan National University. We speak about whether there's cracks forming in the Republican Party, about how best Trump deal with Vladimir Putin, and whether this 50-day ultimatum that he gave the Russian leader should have been 30 days or 20 days, or he should have just invoked these sanctions already to cripple Russia's economy. We also speak about this Epstein file drama and the fact that Donald Trump, while he may have not done anything incriminating, did he know about Jeffrey Epstein's trafficking ring and what went on that? So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on Times Radio's YouTube page, or you can stream us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Robert Kelly, Professor of Political Science at the Pusan National University, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Hi, thanks again for having me.
I want to start off with what I thought was quite an interesting development over the last few days. Republican Congressman Don Bacon, we know he's had really no qualms in throwing Donald Trump down the river. He critiques him where he thinks is needed. It's mostly usually about Vladimir Putin and his handling of the war in Ukraine. But what he did this weekend was he basically gave credit to Melania Trump for Donald Trump's backflip in supporting Ukraine. So he said, I think we owe Melania some thanks here. Even the president said his wife reminds him every day that Russia is bombing Ukrainian cities every night. Trump, of course, last Monday said that with the 50-day ultimatum, and then, of course, agreeing that NATO can buy US weapons. He said, I get home, I'd say, First Lady, I had the most wonderful talk with Vladimir. I think we're finished. And then I turn on the television, or she'll say to me one time, well, that's strange because they just bombed a nursing home. So I want to get your reaction to that. Do we just need Melania this entire time to be reminding the president of what's actually happening overseas?
Sure, sounds good to me. I mean, if it works, why not? I mean, we know there's a long scholarship about how presidents make decisions, and we know that it isn't nearly as formalized as, sort of what you learn when you're in high school, right? I mean, it doesn't actually go all through the National Security Council and then off to Congress for debate before the foreign policy committees. We know that a lot of it is personalistic. We know, at least going back to Harry Truman, that presidents tend to build sort of what we sometimes call kitchen cabinets, right? Sort of little groups of people around them. Lyndon Johnson had what he called the Tuesday group around him when he's fighting the Vietnam War. So it doesn't surprise, and Trump, of course, is way outside the norm in terms of American institutions and following rules that have been laid down previously, right, and precedents. And so it doesn't surprise me at all, actually, that Donald Trump is getting information from all kinds of sources that are outside traditional channels, right? And I mean, to the extent that the U.S. supporting Ukraine is sort of good for liberalism and democracy in the world, I'm all for it if it works.
Congressman Bacon, he also said in this interview that he thinks that Trump's 50-day ultimatum should have been shorter. He thinks he should have given Putin a 20-day or a 30-day ultimatum to end the war, or otherwise risk these further sanctions being put on any country importing anything from Russia, and then, of course, potentially this Russian energy. But do you think that this shows that Trump isn't that serious about Putin, threatening Putin?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I think that's kind of what's on everybody's mind, right? You and I think, have discussed this in the past, that Trump has a tendency to say, we're going to have a plan in 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks passes, and there was like infrastructure and healthcare, all these things were supposed to take 2 weeks, and there's going to be some big plan. And, obviously that's a really kind of a rhetorical strategy for just kicking the can down the road and delay. And I wonder if that's sort of the case here, right? I mean, the war is 3 years old. It's fairly clear at this point. Putin sent us a lot of signals that he really wants to win, and he really rejects the idea that Ukraine should be independent in any meaningful way, and he's willing to use force to prevent that. And so I just kind of wonder if Trump really needs all this time to learn this. I mean, most of the foreign policy community has already learned this, but I mean, if Trump needs another 50 days, again, I guess it's better than nothing. But I think the real concern is what you're saying, which is that it just might be further kicking the can down the road, and then in 50 days we find out that Trump's got some other sort of card up his sleeve or something like that. I don't know where 50 days came from. I'm not sure anybody really does, but it sure looks like pushing the decision into the future.
Bob, Congressman Bankin, he said all of this about Donald Trump's ultimatum, saying that potentially we should reduce it to 20 to 30 days to show Putin that the US is serious about peace. But then this in conjunction with the fact that these 85 senators across both Democrats and Republicans have co-signed, co-sponsored Lindsey Graham's sanctions bill, which is yet to see the Senate floor. It was meant to see it early July. We still haven't seen it hit the Senate floor to be passed. Does this show to you that there seems to be cracks within the Republican Party on how Trump is handling Putin? Because we've obviously got this Republican congressman going on TV and saying that he wished Donald Trump approached this in a different manner. And then, of course, we've got this many Republicans co-signing Lindsey Graham's sanctions bill, which is yet to be passed.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think it's actually fairly well established that on foreign policy, Trump has taken the United States in a direction that a fair amount of the Republican traditional elite is uncomfortable with. I think it's kind of an open question whether or not the MAGA base actually cares that much about a lot of this stuff other than Israel on this. But certainly the Republican elite, I think broadly speaking, is uncomfortable with the direction that Trump has gone, particularly on Europe, right? The Republican Party has been, at least since Eisenhower, arguably Atlanticist, which is to say that sort of has broadly believed in NATO and sort of the Western community and whatever, and that would include you guys down in Australia, right? And that's been around like literally since the 50s. There was an isolationist wing around people like Charles Lindbergh and Robert Taft, a senator from my state, way back in the 40s and 50s, but that was pretty much definitively vanquished by the 1960s, right? And it's really only under Donald Trump that you see this swing back to this sort of like older thinking on the American right about foreign policy. And a lot of American senators have no training in that. They have no background in that. That's not what they come from. And I think you've kind of seen that collision really over Ukraine, where a lot of the traditional internationalist instincts, the Atlanticist instincts that go all the way back to the 50s, right? They're all on display, right? I mean, Lindsey Graham used to be a big partisan of Ukraine, of supporting Ukraine. And then, Trump, because I don't know, perhaps because of Trump's sort of very curious relationship with Putin, which we don't fully understand actually, right? I'm still kind of this weird black hole after 10 years, but that is kind of collided with, I think, this traditional Atlanticism, and that's why I think you get these sort of lurches and these swings back and forth on Ukraine, right? And a lot of it, of course, is sort of following Donald Trump's own experience, right? Where I think his pro-Putinism, for lack of a better word, I don't know if that's a word, but his pro-Putinism is sort of colliding with the reality, right? Which is that Putin doesn't want to stop the war, and Trump is kind of, it seems like the president is going through a sort of learning process, for lack of a better word, in which he realizes that no matter what friendship he has with Vladimir Putin, Putin's war goals are not going to change. And Trump seems genuinely surprised by that.
Which is weird because it's one of those things, Bob, where it says when someone shows you who they are, believe them.
Yeah.
And it really is interesting to see Donald Trump. We know that he's swung back in favor of Ukraine, but he's still not coming out and completely condemning Putin. He's still not coming out and invoking these threats, putting these threats into actual practice. He's given another 50-day deadline, 50 days of fighting and killing that will be ramped up in the summer of offensive, which is what Russia always planned to do and are doing. So you've just given them that opportunity. But Ukraine has officially proposed another round of peace talks with Russia, but Dmitry Peskov, he said that President Putin has repeatedly spoken of his desire to bring the Ukrainian settlement to a peaceful conclusion as soon as possible. This is a long process. It requires effort and it's not easy. The main thing for us is to achieve our goals. Our goals are clear. Now, do you think, Bob, that it's clear from those comments, things like the main thing is for us to achieve our goals, which is, of course, total domination and an invasion of a sovereign country, that peace talks are no longer a viable option in any way, that we should not be even trying to pursue them. Ukraine shouldn't even be trying to pursue them. The United States should not be putting themselves in a position where they're wanting to negotiate a peace talk, because it's clear to anyone watching, any analyst watching, that nothing comes from them.
Yeah, I think really the only benefit at this point to proposing peace talks, at least on the Ukrainian side, is that it looks like they're acting in good faith, right? I mean, an important part of swinging Trump, if you will, behind Ukraine has been the Ukrainians demonstrating that they do in fact want to end the war, that they are in fact willing to work with the Americans, particularly the Trump administration, which really want to end the war. Trump argued that for 6 months as a candidate. He'll end it on day one. It's pretty clear Trump wants to end the war, right? And the Ukrainians had to signal that they were on board with that, right? Which puts the moral onus for the conflict on Putin, which of course, I think, again, as you say, I think most analysts would have argued that for years now. But again, Trump doesn't seem to grasp that. So to the extent the Ukrainians suggest every 3 or 4 months, hey, we should have talks, and the Russian position on the talks is there is no talks, you have to give up everything, that constantly signals to Trump, or perhaps Melania Trump, right, that the Russians don't want to give. Right. And that again, that's sort of Trump learning. That's teaching Donald Trump, for lack of a better word, that his buddy Vladimir Putin is in fact an imperialist, right, and does in fact want to steamroll this sovereign state, which again, Trump just doesn't seem to have grasped that. But I think this is how the Ukrainians are, for lack of a better word, teaching Trump about what Putin is, right? We make these offers, the Russians reject them, and they bomb our cities. I mean, that's pretty obvious signaling that the Russians are not in fact interested in peace. And I guess Trump needs it that blunt to grasp it.
Yeah, and no one's condemning Trump for approaching this originally from a peaceful standpoint. You know, he thought that he'd be able to leverage his relationship, his somewhat civil relationship with Vladimir Putin, to enter this through a peace negotiation with the help of Turkey. But it's not. The problem is that right now, after so many failed attempts, that is clear that that's not the option. That's not the route that we should be going down. And then this extra 50 days of fighting will probably only intensify things. But over the weekend, Bob, Putin's propaganda TV machine has been pumping out photos and videos of its drone death factory, giving the audience a big look around of what their stockpile looks like. But this is also coming off the back of Ukraine's army bombarding Moscow in 5 straight nights of drone attacks on the capital. So Ukraine has vowed to keep up these attacks on Moscow as Russia has kept up their attacks on Kyiv. So how significant do you think this is for Ukraine's army to have had 5 straight successful nights of drone attacks on Moscow?
Yeah, I think reaching behind the lines is actually really important for the Ukrainians, because the only way that probably that Putin will stop this thing is if he encounters significant dissent at home, right? And that means some kind of public resistance, or sort of rumoring, or sort of pressure, sort of people telling their friends in the military, their family, or whatever, why are we doing this, right? Some kind of public discontent bubbling up vaguely through Russia's institutions, and then also inside the Russian elite itself, right? That only when enough people in the Russian military, industry, and so on, Putin's cronies, begin to tell him that this thing is never going to end, we're in some kind of forever war, this is Afghanistan in the 1980s all over again, only then will it end. And so to the extent that the Ukrainians bring the war home, this is how they sort of teach the Russians that this thing is unwinnable. So yeah, I think it's actually smart, even if strategically it doesn't actually, or tactically it doesn't actually get the Ukrainians that much when they blow up some factory and that gets rebuilt, right? By striking inside Russia, you're telling the Russian population and Russian elites this thing is going on and on. It's Vietnam and Afghanistan and all over again. It's just this kind of unwinnable thing. And this is that's probably how the war is going to end. The Russians will get exhausted and just say enough is enough, and they'll either withdraw or they'll sort of cut a deal in which they get to keep what they've taken, including Crimea, and then Ukraine kind of goes its own way. That's probably the most likely end of this. The Russians can't win, but instead what will happen is they'll exhaust themselves and they'll retreat, keeping what they have. And the irony, of course, that's basically what Trump offered them 6 months ago, right? I guarantee in 3 years the war is going to end the way it could have 6 months ago.
Wow. Well, that's a big call, because that would see Ukraine giving up Crimea and along with 20% of land that Russia now occupies, which is, of course, what Putin has been wanting. But he wants that, and then in conjunction, he wants a written word that Ukraine wouldn't have the security of the United States, or wouldn't have a NATO membership and all that. But the 5 nights of attacks were so successful that it saw Moscow shutting down its airport. So Ukraine has won in that regard, but they're still using, on this attack specifically, Bob, they were using Ukrainian-made drones. And of course, they are not as sophisticated as US weaponry that has been sent before, and that it has, some of which has arrived in Ukraine, some of which is still on its way, and some of which has yet to be greenlit to be sent to Ukraine if the Trump administration says yes and passes a new aid package. But I wonder, just going off how successful the Ukrainian army has been with the little resources they have and using these Ukrainian-made drones, is it clear that perhaps US, perhaps NATO should be greenlighting sending more sophisticated long-range missiles such as the Tomahawks, knowing how much of damage and how much reach they can make?
Right. So I think the it's best if the Ukrainians do most of the long range strike stuff into Russia itself with their own stuff. Now we can actually give the Ukrainians the technology and the money and the materials to build a lot of that stuff domestically, but indigenous production is a good way to signal that NATO doesn't want to actually escalate the conflict. Right? I mean, this is something where the Biden people, I mean, we know this about the Biden administration. They kind of went back and forth because the Russians have signaled that heavy use of Western weaponry inside Russia might lead to escalation, particularly with nuclear weapons. We all don't want that, right? So my preference would be that we sort of flood Ukraine with the resources necessary to make this stuff, and that its defense industrial base pump this stuff out itself. And it seems like the Ukrainian defense industrial base is actually stepping up to that. I mean, the Ukrainian economy is now really heavily militarized, and we're supporting it, which is, I guess, what you would expect in a conflict. If the Russians still don't give up, right? If we're still here in like a year, if you and I are having the same conversation next summer, then perhaps we should actually do that. But I think it's still probably best to sort of try to support the Ukrainians doing it themselves domestically, right? Because we're sort of worried about escalation. But I don't know. That argument isn't as efficacious. That argument's not as powerful as it was a couple of years ago, right? Putin's been making nuclear threats for 3 years now. He's pretty obviously bluffing. To be perfectly honest, if we did give the Ukrainians American weapons that did deep strike, it probably wouldn't lead to nuclear escalation. So if the argument is probably tilting, right? That at some point, right, if this thing is still dragging on in like a year or two, maybe if we actually start giving them really, really significant quantities of Western weapons, we might actually get to that exhaustion point, right? The Ukrainians probably aren't going to push the Russians out of their territory completely. My guess is at this point, the end of the war comes from attrition. The Russians just get exhausted, right? They're sacrificing everything for Ukraine. They're losing other strategic goals, like, for example, they're becoming subservient to China, right? The economy is falling apart. You got 20% inflation because the Russian economy is only making weapons that get destroyed, right? That's probably when the Russians are going to give, and perhaps Western weapons would get us faster to that crossover point. But that's my guess for how this thing ends.
Well, even if Trump threatened Putin that he was willing to send these long-range missiles and these significant, sophisticated weapons that the US has that NATO might have, even if that's the threat that he uses on Putin, maybe that could make a difference. But Bob, just moving into the big scandal surrounding the White House in the last week, which is, of course, the Epstein's file scandal, is hanging over Donald Trump. Look, it seems like it's unable to leave him alone right now. What do you think Donald Trump's next steps should be on this?
I'm actually quite surprised. I think the president's really cornered on this. I mean, he really has trained his base through Fox News, through Trumpist right-wing media, Twitter or X and all that for a while. They really have sort of trained their voters, good 25% of the country, that the Epstein files is sort of like this Rosetta Stone for the globalist cabal of pedophiles and all this kind of, right? I highly doubt that, but I mean, it's pretty clear that Epstein and some of the people around him were engaged in those kinds of activities. I don't know if the client list is going to be some big, kind of thing. But at this point, Trump has raised expectations so high, and the people around him as well, again, in the media sphere, that I'm not really sure the president has much of a choice. I have the feeling this thing is going to end up coming out at some point. It'll probably leak, for example, from the Justice Department, because Trump has talked this up for so much, and all of a sudden you get this U-turn, right? And it increasingly looks like the reasoning for the U-turn is that Trump himself is in there, right? And of course, we've all seen this on Twitter and whatnot, and the internet for the last couple of weeks, right? All these pictures are sort of coming out now of how much Trump and Epstein, it looks like they were friends. I mean, you see them sort of ribbing each other and laughing and doubling. I mean, they actually, Trump doesn't have a lot of friends, right? We don't have a lot of photographs of Trump being very empathetic with people, even with his own children. And if you look at Trump with Epstein, it looks like they were friends. And that, that Trump probably knew what Epstein was doing. I mean, if they were friends for 10 to 15 years and Epstein is sort of running this sort of grifty pedophile ring, I bet Trump knew. And I think that's finally breaking through to the American public, right? The information is floating around for 5 or 6 years, but I think that's why Trump can't get out of this. I have the feeling this stuff is either going to come out formally or it'll be leaked.
Bob, I want to reiterate that point of whether he knew or not. So I'm going to read out something that the New York Times was reporting this morning. They're reporting about how Trump could be involved in the Epstein files. Now, Maria Farmer, who worked for Epstein, she told the FBI twice, one of which was in 2006, about looking into Epstein's orbit of people, and she included Donald Trump in that. And that's, of course, a couple of decades before he ran for president. She said that in 1995 at Epstein's Manhattan office, this is a quote from the New York Times, it says, Miss Farmer said that she recalled feeling scared of Mr. Trump, who stared at her bare legs. Then Mr. Epstein entered the room and she recalled him saying to Mr. Trump, no, she's not here for you. The two men left the room and Miss Farmer said she could hear Mr. Trump commenting that he thought Miss Farmer was 16 years old. After the encounter with Mr. Trump, Miss Farmer said that she had no other alarming interactions with him and did not see him engage in inappropriate conduct with girls or women. So right now, it's not really a question of whether Donald Trump was involved personally, specifically with Epstein's sex trafficking ring, his pedophilia ring, but whether or not him, along with other very prominent rich figures in the United States and beyond, knew what was happening and didn't say anything.
Yeah, I think that's really the core issue, and I think I suppose to the credit of sort of the QAnon clique out there, I mean, they grasped this that a lot of wealthy people and influential people were around Epstein, and this really needed to come out, right? I don't think the outcome is going to be nearly as conspiratorial. It's not going to be sort of this Rosetta Stone for a global cabal. I think that stuff is just kind of bonkers. That's fever swamp stuff. But I mean, it's pretty clear that Epstein knew a lot of these people, right? A lot of this has come out, particularly around Trump himself. But what kind of surprises me the most is how much this has been sort of known for a while, right? I mean, these photographs with Trump and Epstein, I mean, these things have been around for 10, 15 years, right? I mean, Trump was friends with them back in the 1990s. I mean, that was 30 years ago, right? And I guess what I wonder, right, from the media is why this is suddenly exploding now as opposed to, 5 or 10 years ago, right? Because Trump's relationship with Epstein, I would argue, has always been suspicious, at least since 2001, when Epstein was finally actually indicted for sex trafficking, right? I mean, that throws a negative light on all of his relationships. And as we pointed out, there are all these photographs and video out there of Trump looking like he's quite friendly with Epstein. So if they were friends, it's kind of awkward that Trump wouldn't know. And it's possible Trump would know. Benefit of the doubt and the whole bit, right? I mean, it should be investigated, and right, there should be some kind of discussion of this. We shouldn't automatically assume that Trump knew, but I mean, he was friends with this guy in a way that, suggests that it should at least be out there in the public so we can look at it ourselves. And I think that's what Trump is kind of locked in on now. He can't really get out of that.
Well, we know that he, of course, almost got his MAGA constituents to, yes, believe that this was a big scandal that needed to be resolved, that needed to be released to the public. But now, of course, he's blaming Democrats for their desire for Donald Trump to follow through with his word. Now, I don't want to say that Trump campaigned on this promise, because he very much didn't campaign on releasing the Epstein files. But when he was asked running, he said that, yeah, he would look at it. And then, of course, Pam Bondi said that the files are on her desk. So there's a lot of contradictory things. But an interesting comparison, Bob, I thought, was Amy Klobuchar. I don't know how to say her name, a Minnesota Democrat. She was on with Jake Tapper on Sunday. She said the president blaming Democrats for this disaster is like the CEO that got caught on camera blaming Coldplay.
Yeah, I mean, Trump is the president. Right? I mean, if Bill Clinton was still president or something like that, Bill Clinton's relationship with Epstein would be much more politically valent. But Trump is the president, and again, the video makes it look an awful lot like Trump and him were friends. I think that's the really damning part, right? Particularly given that Trump doesn't seem to have a lot of close friends. The fact that he was so chummy with Epstein, right, at the peak of Epstein's scandalous sort of pedophilic behavior, at the same time, right? The overlap of those two things chronologically, I think, is what is getting Trump in so much trouble and why he can't shake this. I mean, maybe he can pass it over and dump it on the Democrats. I don't know, but I don't think anybody believes that. I mean, if his base isn't going to buy it, the rest of us aren't, right? And Trump is he's pushing a rock uphill. I don't know if he can do it.
The other thing that happened was that Donald Trump last week, he called for relevant grand jury testimony in the prosecution of Mr. Epstein to be publicly released, and has repeatedly dismissed any notion of that. He basically has nothing to hide. So if that was released, would it be enough to clear Trump's name of any potential wrongdoing?
So as I understand it, not being a lawyer myself, as I understand it, that testimony is actually distinct from what the Trump world refers to as the Epstein files, right? Which is sort of the client list, right? I don't know if that client list exists. Perhaps the Attorney General is correct; it just doesn't exist. I'm actually rather skeptical myself that you're going to find anything beyond a lot of sleazy men who wanted to sleep with young women. I don't actually think that this is some key to some big thing, like the Panama Files or something like that. But I do think that Trump is trying to sort of distract attention enough with the grand jury stuff to step around this issue of the files and the client list, and maybe it'll work. But again, I mean, Trump has really sort of beaten this, right? The Trump world has really developed the Epstein thing into this gigantic. It's kind of like what fascism thought the protocols of the Elders of Zion was 100 years ago, sort of like this key that explains sort of the Jewish conspiracy to take over the world, right? I mean, Epstein has become that, right, inside Trump world. And I just don't know if they can be satisfied, right? I mean, you got people like, well, what's his name? InfoWars guy out there, saying like Trump's been taken over by the deep state, because they've been believing this stuff for, 5 years now, 8 years, right? I mean, this is like a core part of MAGA ideology. And I don't know if Trump can just make a U-turn and leave it.
I mean, he's been grooming them to believe that there's something that
Yeah,
needs to be that needs to be exposed. So it's going to take a lot more than denial, denial, denial. So, Robert Kelly, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you for having me.